God gives the knowledge of the Vedas to Brahma. But Brahma does not understand the Vedas by himself. So God graces Brahma with his divine knowledge, then Brahma is able to understand the Vedic teachings. Then from Brahma, the knowledge of the Vedas is imparted to the 7 sages, Atri, Angiras, etc. And then from the 7 sages, the Saptarishis, the knowledge comes to us, ordinary humans, through various gurus, various saints, various messengers of God. The knowledge of Vedas is eternal. Hinduism is an eternal religion. Buddhism, Jainism, Sikhism have gained tremendous inspiration from Hinduism. Sikhism actually evolved from Hinduism, as did Buddhism. And the greatest thing about Hinduism is the tremendous knowledge that we have at our disposal. But there are so many misconceptions about Hinduism, and it would serve us well to talk about these misconceptions. The first big misconception about Hinduism is that Hinduism is polytheistic. That Hinduism believes in many, many gods. The novice goes to the temple, sees many forms of God, and he says, look at these Hindus. They believe in many, many gods. They're pagan. Little does he realize the greatness that is manifested there due to the fact that there are many forms of God. One God, there is one God, the Vedas say, Eko Deva, there is. Ek meaning one. Eko Deva, there is one God. But that one God has countless forms. Ananta Nama Rupaya Vishnave. Vishnu, meaning God, has countless Ananta Nam, names, and Rup, forms. Every religion besides Hinduism says God is without name and form. Hinduism says that is true. God is without name and form. But Hinduism says don't just end right there, also accept that God is also with name and form. God is without name and form, and we refer to that aspect of God as Brahma. God is with name and form, and we know many, many names and many forms. There's Bhagwan Shankar, there's Bhagwan Ganeshji, there is Bhagwan Sri Ram, there's Bhagwan Sri Krishna. There are many female aspects of God, Mother Durga, Mother Kali, there's Mother Radha, Mother Sita. There are so many different forms of God. Sometimes God comes in the male form, sometimes in the female form, sometimes he comes in the animal form. And people say, look at these crazy Hindus, they're worshipping monkeys and elephants. The depth of Hinduism is tremendous. These are not monkeys. This is not a monkey. Hanumanji is not a monkey. Hanumanji is a form of God. He's Bhagwan Shankar himself. God shows us, look, I am not restricted to one form. I can take any form that I want. There are no limits. Don't place your limits on me, says God. We have only assumed one form at one time. We cannot just change forms at will. And then we think that God is just like us. God is a human like us. God is subject to limitations like we are. So we think God can only have one form, or God can only be formless. God says, I am formless, I am with a form. And when I do assume a form, I assume countless forms. And another misconception, a grand misconception in the mind about Hinduism is that Hindus worship idols. I'm sure many of you have heard that. The Hindus, you worship idols. Or we think, Hindus themselves think, we are idol worshippers. Not so. We are not worshipping idols, we are worshipping God. But what about those statues? What about those idols, those murtis in the mandir? Those are images of God. Those are various images of God. They are powerful reminders of God. When we look at the murti of Hanumanji, we see devotion. we see Bhagwan Shankar, we see divinity, we don't see anything else. The Hindu mind is trained to think like this. You don't see anything else, but you see divinity there, and you bow your head, and you get a few tears in your eyes. When we see Bhagwan Shri Krishna, when we see the Murti of Krishna, we don't see a boy playing a flute. We see divinity. We see God who assumed this very loving and very mischievous form. When we see Bhagwan Sri Ram's Murti, we see Maryada Purushottam Bhagwan Sri Ram. We see God in his serious form, God who did everything by the book. He obeyed all the rules. And then we are amused because we think right beside him is his other form, that of Krishna, in which he followed no rules. He broke all the rules. In one form he observes all the rules. Then he comes back and he says, I'm not going to observe any rule, I'm going to break all of them. And the Hindu mind is able to think, look at how wonderful it is that one God, my Lord, he has assumed this form and that form. Because some people prefer the serious form, some people prefer the very loving and mischievous form. Some prefer to think of God as a goddess. So the Vedas say, Tvam Stri, Tvam Puman, Tvam Kumar, Utava Kumari, Tvam Jirno Dandena Vanchasi. My Lord, you sometimes appear in the world in the form of a young woman. Sometimes you appear in the world in the form of a young man. And sometimes you appear in the world in the form of a very, very old man who is walking with the help of a walking stick. Dandena vanchasi. In this way, you deceive the worldly people. You come to the world in many, many different forms. There was once a king. He asked his minister. The minister was Hindu, the king was not. But the king was a very pious man. He asked his minister, why is it that you Hindus say that God appears in the world? Why would God need to do that? I don't understand. The minister was a very witty minister. He was very clever, very wise. So he said, my Lord, please give me some time and I shall give you an answer to this question. So the king said, all right. A few weeks passed and the minister said to the king, I think it would be very nice if you had some entertainment in the form of boating. So if it pleases you, my Lord, may I arrange for a boating trip with you and your queens and your children? And the king agreed to that. He said, that's a good idea. So a boating trip was planned. They were going to cross the river. They were going to go into a river in a boat. And so the king was now on the boat and his queens were there. And one of his queens had given birth to a child. It was a baby girl. That child was still an infant and there was the maid who was taking care of the child. She was holding the child in her arms. And the minister had told the maid something. He had made a plan with her. So as they were boating and the king was having a grand old time, the king was just looking at his little infant who was in the arms of the maid, and Birbal, who was a minister, he gave the signal to the maid and the maid quietly threw the child into the river. She threw the child into the river and the king was horrified. He didn't say anything, he didn't ask anything, he just jumped inside and brought his child out. And then he realized that this was not his child, this was a doll made of wax. And it really resembled his child. And now he scolded the maid, what do you mean by doing this? I almost had a heart attack. Why did you do this? The maid was terrified. She said, please forgive me. It wasn't my idea. She pointed to the minister. She said it was Birbal's idea.